Welcome back to HTML and CSS. This week we are going to take a little bit of a break from HTML before we go into working with CSS and HTML next week. So before you really start working on files, it's really good for you to know just general design basics. And so this week I'm going to cover general design basics, file organization, how to actually publish your files and use FileZilla to publish to your student server space. So you're going to know why you should design things a certain way before we actually start going over how to do all the different types of styles with CSS, and then how to work with your files so that way you have a better understanding of how linking works and just how to work with your files in general before things get too much more complicated. And so you'll notice with the homework assignments that you're going to have, and sorry, it's going to look like there's a lot of things here. Assignment 2 and assignment 3 are not going to require you to work with HTML or your text editor. Instead, both of them are going to be writing assignments where you're going to be using your textbook and you're going to be answering some questions that are towards the end of the chapter and doing a little bit of research and just kind of exploring different ideas, both with design and then also thinking about working with your files. So the reason why we have so many resources under week 2 is because there's a lot of design things that I want to cover. So, and you'll also notice, I feel like it's hard to break the content into smaller videos for this week. So you're just going to have to bear with me by having these longer videos going over a lot more information. And to give you a bit of an idea, and these video links and everything will be a little bit different for you, but when you get to the resources section, I divide things so that way they parallel pretty well with the chapters. So chapter 3 is going to be talking about design, and so I have a bunch of design related links. All of the things that are in here are things that I'm going to talk about in this video, and I wanted to put all of these links here so that way if you want to come back and look at them, you can. But you don't have to feel pressured to spend a lot of time on these or like go through and read these in a lot of detail. So it's good for you to just go through and, you know, if something seems interesting, bookmark it. I've got universal design styles, choosing color palette, links, and then this is where, so what we're going to do with our chapters is we did chapter 1, chapter 2, we're going to do chapter 3, and then I'm going to have us jump all the way to chapter 12 because that's where the textbook actually talks about how to publish your files, and it talks about hosting and all of these things that I think are really important to cover towards the beginning of the semester. So we're going to jump to chapter 12, and that's going to cover these web publishing links. And a lot of these are just kind of resources. Again, it's something that will get talked about in the video. You don't have to go and do any reading on your own. It's kind of up to you on which ones you want to go and look at in more detail. And then there's the homework is going to be read chapter 3, read chapter 12, do the assignments that pair with those chapters. There's quizzes. There's quiz 3 covers chapter 3. Where things get a little bit more confusing is quiz 4 is over chapter 12, and then the count is going to be a little bit weird going on, but we'll eventually kind of sort things out with that. I've got a couple of discussions here too where this will get covered in the videos, but I'm going to want you to engage with these discussions. And if you want to go back and reference the PowerPoint, I've got the week 3. It's kind of labeled off because it is called week 3 because that's where it would be if this was a full semester long class. But this is going to cover the chapter 3 PowerPoint. So that's what I'm going to open up. All right, so I'm going to be jumping back and forth a little bit with some of those resources that I had on campus to kind of help illustrate certain points. if you have studied graphic design or art to some degree, some of these things might be familiar to you, but there are going to be quite a few things that are unique about designing for web that would be different even from working with graphic design. All right, so this picture should look familiar. We looked at it, but a much blurrier version of it in a previous video. And this is looking at that website organization. And I talked about this in the other video in talking about sitemaps and how everything is organized. So that's one of the pieces where you really want to think about this general structure. Something that I didn't mention though in that video was talking about templates and how when you're designing, you will usually design templates and try to keep the hierarchy consistent throughout your pages, so that way it's easy for people to expect how to navigate your pages and they will get more familiar with the pages themselves. All right, so this is a concept that borrows from newspapers and is this idea of having eye-catching information be above the fold. So with a newspaper, it would be the newspapers are folded in half, and so you would want to have a nice large graphic and a nice headline at the top of your page, and then when you would flip it down, you would get smaller information below that that would slowly get more specific and kind of less eye-catching. And we do the same thing with websites, where basically whatever you see before you start scrolling, that would be our above the fold. And so you'll usually find a large image that would be called a hero image. Towards the top, you'll find your H1 information to give an idea of what the website's going to be about. You should be able to see your navigation, so that way you have an idea of how to navigate this space. You have an idea of all of your options. So you want to try to have as much of your important information in that first part of the screen. Now, this is a list of different modern navigation menus, and there's so much more to go over with navigation, and you'll hear about this more in future classes, but I just wanted to give you a general idea. And I've got a link that talks about 10 types of modern navigation menus. Now, whether those are commonly used or not, we'll have to kind of take a look at it and see. But some things to know about would be having your navigation bar. So that would just be your horizontal or your vertical navigation bar. If it's horizontal, it's usually in the top right corner. And then if it's vertical, a lot of times it'll be on the left side. And we'll kind of get into a little bit of why that is. Another type of navigation would be breadcrumb navigation. And this is where I'm going to jump around. Let me see if I can find an image. Okay, here are two different examples. And you'll see these a lot on large e-commerce websites. I kind of like this example here of this computer website. So the idea is, as you are going through the navigation and you're choosing different items, this breadcrumb trail, like the fairy tale, it shows the path that you have traveled, and it tells you how you can kind of go back to previous areas. So let's say that you are indeed shopping for a computer. Maybe you go to computer and then you go to laptops, and then from laptops maybe you go to a MacBook Pro or something, and then, or a MacBook Air, and then you realize, oh, maybe I want to have I don't want a Mac computer, I want something else. So then you could go back in that history to see other categories. This is also helpful though, because let's say that you go to a search engine and you just type in an item and it takes you directly to that products page on that e-commerce website. And from there, you want to see other items that are kind of similar. You can still see a breadcrumb trail that will tell you of kind of larger categories that item fits into. So it could help you with figuring out your own trail, but then it could also help you jump in and see other categories that item fits inside of. And it just sort of depends on how the website is organized, on how detailed that process might be. Maybe some of them will track that more, or make it easier for you to jump into it. All right, so another potential one would be graphics for navigation. This is sort of a vague idea, but essentially you could, instead of having text written out that you could click on, you could actually have different images. Maybe it's logos or something. Like if you think about a website on your phone, maybe you want to have little icons that would take up less space that you could click on, and then that could take you to different places in your navigation. Dynamic navigation. So this would be something like a drop-down menu. Again, e-commerce would be a good example of this. Even our school website, we've got a drop-down menu where you can go and you can see more items. This makes sense for really large websites where you don't want the navigation to take up a whole lot of space. And then a site index is a way for you to kind of look at a bunch of different files on a website. It's basically a directory of everything. You really don't see site indexes as often as you used to. It used to be really easy to just go and look at a site index, and it's kind of a nice way of looking at everything that was on a website. So we're going to go to this link, and some of these will be sort of out of order, but you should see all of the links here to some degree. All right, 10 types of modern navigation menus. I thought this was a really interesting list. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit. So this is something you're probably familiar with, but you might not have known the name for, and that's a hamburger menu button. And that's when you have got these 3 lines going over top of each other. It helps to minimize, and it helps insinuate that there's more things that are going to be there, and if you click on it, it will show up in some way, whether it slides onto the page or it pops up. That's a hamburger menu. And then they've got this interesting navigation in the fixed centered layout, and this is the sort of design that really goes against convention, and it really would only work well for a small website. And this looks to me like it would be someone's portfolio website. So what they've done is, normally you would have your logo in the top left and you'd have your navigation across the top. And instead they've put their logo in the center, and then they've asked these questions, and that would presumably take you to different areas. That would, like, who would be like an about page, what might be a statement about themselves, where and how might be contact information, and that would help you kind of find everything. Now, you would really want to think about your target audience and who's looking at this website. If something it kind of goes against your expectations, it can be hard to necessarily engage with that content. This is looking at full screen multimedia based navigation, and I feel like I see this more with maybe like movie websites where they've got these large pictures that help illustrate different content. It might also be sort of the intro of a website where you've got a little bit of kind of the landing page information, and then once you click on it, it starts kind of going more into a traditional website. I feel like I've seen this too with fashion, car websites, all sorts of different ones, but usually kind of giving you a bit of a feeling first of the branding and then going into more detail. And you'll notice that there's a little bit of overlap. Like here, there's a hamburger menu as well. So this is an interesting category, interactive navigation. This is something that is trying to simulate an experience of going through a museum. And so in this case, the navigation is trying to be a little bit more concealed, so that way it's easier for you to navigate the space. And it could be that you click on the names of the exhibits in order to kind of go into those room spaces, and then there's kind of more hidden navigation throughout the rest of the space. Slide out menu, this is one that really is being paired with the hamburger menu. I don't know that this necessarily needs to be in 2 separate categories. I would combine these, but the idea here is that you have, and it doesn't have to be just a hamburger menu. There's other ways of illustrating that as well, but some way you would have some sort of icon that would show that there is a larger menu that is being concealed. And again, it could slide onto the screen, it could pop up. Static sidebar navigation. Now, this is just illustrating that, a lot of times you have navigations in the top, especially the top right, but every once in a while you'll have navigations to the left. And so that's going to be just an option that you might consider depending on the website. Streamlined nav bar. This, I don't know that necessarily needs to be separated from just having a traditional navigation. I think the idea they were trying to have here is just the fact that it doesn't have a border on it, and it's just kind of text that's covering over top of everything. It feels like it's part of the greater whole. It's not necessarily inside of a distinctive header, for example. Now this one I think is a good example, and it's one that we had in the PowerPoint, was just having some sort of drop-down list. So this one is looking at Adidas, and we've got different categories: football, running, basketball, training, other sports, and there's tons of different ways to look at the different options for clothing, shoes, accessories, etc. So because there's so many different ways that people could want to browse and look for information, they've created this drop down so that way it wouldn't take up a ton of space. Footer navigation. Now, I don't mind the example that is here for a footer navigation, but I would like to say that it is normal to have a footer navigation, and usually your footer navigation would have more items that not everybody needs to find. It could be contact information, policy information, privacy information. A lot of times if you're looking for job opportunities, you'll find that information in the bottom of a website. You might also find social media information. And so it's information that's important, but usually it's something that you recognize that it's maybe not for everyone, so you put it towards the bottom. But because we're used to seeing that, we know to scroll down and find it. Now, this is doing something else. This is putting the primary navigation in the footer, and I would say that this would really depend on what kind of website. This looks to me like somebody's portfolio, or it could be a movie or something that's being promoted. And so they're wanting this to feel a little bit more cinematic, and so they've decided to open up the top of the website page so that way you can view images and video, and then the navigation is on the bottom so that way it doesn't get in your way. So that's kind of an atypical use of having a lower navigation. So this next one is, again, kind of interesting, but it can potentially confuse people. And that is having a parallax-powered website. And you can look at the definition here. Projects that are driven by parallax quite often opt for plain graphic-based navigation. The circles or dashes that are rarely accompanied by the titles are used to help viewers not get lost. I would say I still think that people get fairly lost when they encounter websites like this. So you do want to be careful. I think people are getting a little bit more used to working with websites like this, especially now that people are getting a little bit more familiar with working with mobile websites. And this is kind of hard to see. I don't know if I can. It looks like I can't enlarge that, but there's this navigation on the left that it looks like you can kind of see all the different areas that you could look for more information. There's this little arrow here, but some of these things I think often get overlooked, and if somebody was used to navigating a more traditional website, they might get confused working with a navigation like this. This one's kind of an interesting choice. It would just sort of depend on the website. This looks like a, under construction kind of website where it's just an absence of navigation. I have seen plenty of websites though where maybe the website is more of a brochure of sorts, like for a concert or an event, and it just needs to list the basic information and doesn't need to have multiple pages. It just is just a single page website. But even then, there's usually some sort of navigation that kind of helps jump down to specific sections on the website. And so I would say that this is probably not going to be as typical if you have a good size of information. If you don't have a lot of information, then something like this might work. And then this one I thought was very interesting because they're using these pictures and then they are kind of designating a space that you could click on, I'm assuming, for the links. And to try to make it so it's less confusing, they are making sure that the text is all uppercase. It's got a little red dot next to it to try to help signify that that's something that's interactive. And then there's the border around it to also make that stand out and look more like a button, even though visually it just looks like a picture. Something that's a little confusing is the fact that they're putting the name, the logo in kind of the center, and it's very large. This is something that I think that could be confusing. Even though it's all lowercase, it doesn't have the red dot. I would think that someone might think that that is something that's clickable. And so I think that would be better maybe towards the top or kind of lower down or smaller or something. But I think that makes it a little bit confusing. And this is the sort of thing that would only really work on a landing page. Then when you go to any of these other pages, you couldn't have the navigation take up this much space. You'd have to have something else anyway. So this really only works in kind of smaller areas. All right, so the next section is looking at having fluid layouts, and there's going to be some terms that I'm going to use sort of interchangeably, and that's fluid, liquid, responsive. The idea is when people first made websites, we were making websites for fixed sized monitors. People were only looking at websites on monitors. They weren't looking at them on tablets or phones or anything. And so in order to show the content the way that we wanted, everything was done in set pixel dimensions. So that way you would have a very clear idea of how it was being shown on the screen. And that worked fine for the longest time. But now that we are looking at content on so many different sized screens, and the variation in sizes changes so much between having a very large, like ultra wide screen monitor all the way down to a phone, we can't expect how people might be looking at content. And so rather than using a fixed dimension like pixels, we are moving towards working with percentages, so that way the website resizes to fit appropriately on the content. And there's going to be a lot of different ways of designing specifically for mobile. But this is one of the first ideas, is changing the units of how you organize your content. So rather than saying that you want a fixed size of 620 pixels for something, instead, you would try to figure out the general ratio that you would want of that item. So in this case, it's 64.6% to fill up that space. And then no matter what size the screen, it's always going to take up that amount of space. So that is called fluid. And you can think of it like, and it's also called liquid. So the idea being that it fills the container that it's in. Now, I also said that responsive design was going to be tied into this idea. And the idea of responsive design is back when people were making these fixed websites and people started to look at websites on mobile devices, the mobile experience required there to be multiple website versions. So you would have a desktop version and you would have a mobile version, and they'd be very different. Sometimes they would have different addresses even. You might have noticed before that when you go to a website, you get on your phone, you get redirected to a website that has lowercase m in front of it, and it's designating that it's a mobile version of that website. So you'll still encounter websites that are specifically mobile versions. But rather than having to design two different experiences that are vastly different, the idea of a responsive web design is that you have one single website that is designed for all experiences, and it just has set styles that kick in at different sizes. So this picture is a little bit blurry, but the idea here is you would have your desktop version of your website, where we have a navigation on the left, and then we have some sort of sidebar content to the right. And then as it is being viewed on a kind of tablet size, that sidebar no longer has room. So it stacks underneath the main content, and then the navigation still appears on the screen. It just maybe takes up a little bit less space. And then as it resizes down to a mobile version, then everything starts stacking up on top of each other. In this case, the navigation gets a lot larger, so it's easier to click on with your fingers on a touch screen. And so these could all be the same HTML content. It's just different styles kick in at different points. And we'll get into that eventually in a couple weeks. So this is looking at how when websites were first being created, they were of course being created for desktop, and then there became a new market for mobile and tablet website versions. And so what would happen is people would design for desktop, and well, a couple of things. So going back to that idea of a fixed design, you might have encountered some older websites that still aren't made well for mobile, and you have to resize and kind of zoom in on the screen to actually be able to see anything. So having that desktop version on a mobile experience can be a really painful experience. It can be really hard to navigate, and you can be really overwhelmed with information. So kind of the first thing there is just it not being changed at all, and just having way too much information for how small that screen space is. And then another approach that you would have, this is more of an intentional approach, would be deleting all sorts of different things. The idea being to recognize the screen and that there's a smaller amount of space on it, and just removing all sorts of content. And so somebody who's experiencing the desktop version is going to have a much fuller experience, and someone who is encountering the content on a mobile device is going to have more of a subpar experience because things have been deleted from their experience. So the idea with having a mobile first approach is if you start first thinking about the users who are looking at the content on mobile, you're going to make sure that all of the essential information is there and that nothing is cut out. And then as you're adding screen space to the design, then you can start adding in and kind of rearranging things, but you can make sure that you're designing all things at the same time and that you're considering everybody at the same time, and you're not cutting something out that might potentially ruin someone's experience. And you've probably all gone to at least some website before where you just couldn't navigate it because something had gotten removed from the mobile version that does exist on the desktop that for some reason got cut out on the mobile. All right, so this next section is going to be talking about different types of design ideas. And before going into color and typography and all of that, I just wanted to talk about what this idea of design is, and then in particular looking at this word aesthetics, which I think is a misunderstood word, especially nowadays, but I think it's always been kind of a misunderstood word anyways. So here I have this definition from Merriam-Webster Dictionary, which I don't necessarily agree with, but I recognize that it's a common definition. So that is, aesthetics is a branch of philosophy that explores the nature of art, beauty, and taste with the creation and appreciation of beauty. I don't mind the majority of this definition. The part that I find to be, I think I don't know if I want to say controversial, but I think the part of it that kind of narrows it down a little bit too much is this idea of the appreciation of beauty. And I'll get into that. But first I wanted to cover the aesthetic universals. So I really liked this list. Philosopher Dennis Dutton identified 6 universal signatures in human aesthetics. And what I did for the artwork on here is I went to Google and I just typed in aesthetics to see what sort of imagery would pop up. I think you're probably not surprised at all to see what kind of images would come up with this idea of aesthetic. All right, so first one, expertise or virtuosity. Humans cultivate, recognize, and admire technical artistic skill. We admire things that we know take a lot of time for people to get practiced at, and things that we know that take a lot of artistry and talent to be able to create, whatever it might be. It could be woodworking, it could be doing like building architecture or something. Whatever would require a lot of technical artistic skill, we're going to recognize that is something to be admired. And then their next one would be non-utilitarian pleasure. People enjoy art for art's sake. And what I like to think about for this would be like furniture. There's always that furniture that people are drawn to because they like the way that it looks. But it could be maybe you've got a family member that you can think of where they've got the most uncomfortable chair or like couch, but they just really like the way that it looks. And so, or maybe you're even that person, and you put up with it because you really like the style of it and how it looks. Style, artistic objects and performances satisfy rules of composition that place them in a recognizable style. When I think of style like this, I tend to think a lot about just the general styles that have changed over time. It could be fashion, music. I think everyone has kind of a general style that they're drawn to, or it could be a couple different types of styles. And style, I think, is a better word than aesthetic because I think it helps break things down into kind of more recognizable patterns and kind of groupings of things that we recognize. Criticism. People make a point of judging, appreciating, and interpreting works of art. And this is something I think that you see a lot in like film, books, movies, video games, music, just this idea that we like to be able to talk about things. So if something is so dull that you can't even think of anything to talk about, then it's probably not something that you're going to appreciate. Even if it's something that you hate, that really pisses you off, and you just, it drives you crazy how something might be styled or how it might look, the fact that people are even talking about it can make it interesting. And there was a lot of fine artists throughout history who really played with the idea of what actually counts as art by just putting anything into a gallery and saying, well, I'm saying it's art, I'm saying that I created it, even if it was found. And it really helped drive up the conversation, and that itself, the conversation, is what made it important. So we like to be able to criticize things. Imitation. With a few important exceptions like abstract painting, works of art simulate experiences of the world. So we are drawn to things that remind us of our experiences. It could be looking at paintings where somebody's done a really nice job of making the painting look recognizable to something that we're used to seeing. It could be like landscapes or something. And then kind of on the flip side of that, special focus. Art is set aside from ordinary life and made a dramatic focus of experience. And this is where I think a lot about movies, books, really giving you the opportunity to explore different ideas that you wouldn't necessarily be able to explore in your everyday life. So these are different areas that you could think about when you are thinking about aesthetics. Now, going back to this idea of where I take issue with this term of beauty, I would define aesthetics as being the things that draw you in as a viewer, that evoke emotion from you. And I think the important part of it is that it's evocative and that there is some emotion and connection to what you are seeing. And so I picked these movie posters because I think that if you were to see them in a movie theater, you would be interested in looking at them. They have very strong designs, very powerful, but at least, I don't know about you, but I don't think these are beautiful. I think especially the middle one, looks quite gross with all that texture on that guy's face. But they're very strong compositions. They've got really strong colors. They've got really great typography choices. The composition really draws you in. Just everything about them just really catches your eye. But I don't think they're beautiful. I maybe wouldn't want to hang them up in my house. I guess it would sort of depend a little bit on your style and if it kind of fits in with the rest of your aesthetic. So I think these are just as powerful aesthetically as something that would be just as much as something like this. And in fact, I think that there could be more to be said for these posters and what they're trying to communicate versus some of these images which are just meant to look pretty. So that's why I wanted to show you that there's a bunch of different pieces to aesthetics and what's important about them. This is kind of a bit of caution about focusing too much on style at the sacrifice of how something actually functions. So beware style. Form should follow function. It's very easy for us to get really excited about how we are styling something and forget about how someone might experience something. And that's where down the line we've got some classes. There's technical interface skills, which focuses on UI, and then there's a user experience class that focuses specifically on UX and doing usability testing and actually seeing what is the user experience like when people are interacting with things. And you can probably all come up in your mind with some examples of poor user experiences that perhaps the website had really great design, but it just didn't work out well. I included this because your book focuses in particular on these different areas of personal preferences and how, depending on your target audience and who you are designing for, how you might need to change things based off those individuals. And you might need to take into consideration layout, colors, graphics, fonts, etc. Now, I'm going to go into more detail than the book. The book kind of covers things very briefly. I didn't say this in the syllabus video. I'll make sure that I include it in the introduction, but my background is in fine art. I've got a BFA in drawing and I've got an MFA in design. And so I very much like to focus on design and how it helps communicate information. So the book does cover some nice basics, but I think there could be even more to be said that could really help set you up for the future. So anyways, first we'll take a look at this. And this is an idea that you will hear about a lot in your classes. And that's taking this idea of your target audience. So the target audience is who you are targeting of your audience. It's pretty straightforward if you think of it like that. Who your users are, who's going to be the majority of your audience. You could have multiple target audiences. So you want to identify who's your main audience, and then, if there's any other significant ones. And then what you do is you create a persona, and the persona, it's not a real person. It's going and collecting data and then turning that data into sort of an approximation of what your audience would look like, and trying to take into consideration the whole diversity of your target audience through your personas. Usually you'll want to create maybe about 3 personas, so you're not designing for just one. You have a couple, and then what happens with that design is as you are going through and you're trying to pick your different styles, you would think about, okay, how would Susan Johnson feel about this design? Would she get frustrated with the hamburger menu? Would she be able to understand how a hamburger menu works based off of her general previous her general previous interactions with technology? Like here it shows that she is kind of a little bit lower on the mobile apps end. So maybe she would feel less comfortable working with a hamburger menu versus somebody who's got more background working with it. So this is where it's really helpful to try to put in as much information. I personally like to have more of the information on what does their technology use, what sort of devices are they used to, what sort of social media do they use, what is the breakdown, do they spend most of their time on a mobile device, do they spend more time on desktop? And you'll notice here there's different goals or frustrations. How would they respond to something? Is maybe one of their frustrations is if a website page doesn't load quickly, they're going to bounce and go somewhere else. So all of these things, they give you kind of a general idea of that person and how to design for them. The next thing I wanted to cover is working with universal design, because as great as it is to design for personas, we want to make sure that we don't forget anybody and that we try to design things so that way you don't have to worry about building in accessibility, because universal design tries to take into consideration everybody so that way you don't have to accommodate specific scenarios. If you design universally, you should hit everybody. So a couple of key areas of universal design is having things be perceivable. You want to add text descriptions. You want there to be multiple ways for people to get information. So if you've got a video, have a transcript or captions. If you have audio, have a transcript. If you have images, have alternative text descriptions for that. Think about how your website is operable. Could somebody be able to navigate your website with just a mouse or just a keyboard? Is it understandable? Is it easy to read? Does it have helpful error messages? Is it robust? Is it written to different standards? Does it actually validate? And I've got a YouTube video here that I want you to watch on your own. And you're going to find these under the universal design section. So there's this really great video on why we need universal design. So you're going to want to make sure that you go and you watch that on your own. And then I've got this link here for just general information about universal design and breaking that down into further detail. So if you want to do things in order, I would say pause this video, go watch the other one, come back, start back up here. It's not going to be the end of the world, though, if you watch these out of order, though. That would be fine. But that one's going to be a really great video. Now, this website, this is universaldesign.ie. So you can find all sorts of information about universal design. Definitions. I linked in particular to the 7 principles, but there's also case studies and examples, benefits, 10 things to know, organizations, history. So what I wanted to do was go over these 7 principles and talk about some examples of what this might look like for us. Now, with this universal design, it's talking about everything. Architecture, physical items. Now, we're just thinking about things that you can access on the internet through screens. So some things aren't going to apply as much. But I think just going through this list, when you're looking at publishing your websites, go and consider this first before you actually launch a website, and it'll help give you some insight into things that you might have overlooked. So first one, equitable use. The design is useful and marketable to people with diverse abilities. So some guidelines here: provide the same means of use for all users, identical whenever possible, equivalent when not. So a good example of this would be, everyone, whether they're on a mobile phone or they're on a desktop, should be able to access your website. Avoid segregating or stigmatizing any users. Provisions for privacy, security, and safety should be equally available to all users. Make the design appealing to all users. So don't just make one group an afterthought. You want to make sure that you equally design for everyone. Second principle, flexibility in use. The design accommodates a wide range of individual preferences and abilities. A good example of this might be allowing your website to be viewed in a light mode and a dark mode. So that way people can kind of change things based off of what they prefer. Provide choice in methods of use. Accommodate left or right-handed access and use. I don't know how many times I've seen things where it's not easy to click on for a person who's left-handed. It could even be just putting links way too close to the edge of the screen on a mobile device. I've seen that a lot where it's really hard to click on. Facilitate the user's accuracy and precision. Provide adaptability to the user's pace. Principle 3, simple and intuitive. Use of the design is easy to understand regardless of the user's experience, knowledge, language skills, or current concentration level. And one that I feel like I've seen that works really well is I've seen some really great websites where when you're filing your taxes, which I think is hard for everyone to really understand. But it could be in particular difficult for people who maybe English isn't their first language, and maybe there aren't a lot of language options available on the website. I've seen some really great websites that use infographics to help illustrate, what the different things are that are being asked for. So it's taking into consideration, everybody needs to be able to file their taxes, and it needs to be easily communicated to everyone. So that's something that I've found before that I really liked, was having websites like that try to illustrate things. And I'm just a huge proponent of infographics in general. All right, so eliminate unnecessary complexity, be consistent with user expectations and intuition, accommodate a wide range of literacy and language skills. Same thing too, if you're trying to talk to a very wide audience, both children all the way up to older individuals, you want to make sure that the language that you're using is something that someone could read. And there's different websites that you can use that can actually go and they can check the level of writing of your website. I think if I remember right, the average website should have kind of about 6th grade level writing. So that way it's more accessible to all users. So that would be something to consider. Arrange information consistent with its importance. So think about that hierarchy. More important information towards the top and kind of larger, draw you in, and then things that are less important, you want to have them kind of fade into the background a little bit, so that way it doesn't get overwhelming. Provide effective prompting and feedback during and after task completion. I don't know how many times I've, tried to fill out a form or something and I get a very vague prompt back, and it kind of makes me wonder, did it actually go through? Did it actually get processed? So telling people when something works or telling people when things don't work, using colors to help communicate the information. You can have little animations that help show you that something's processing, or even just showing, a loading icon to let people know that something's actually working. I've seen so many times where something just kind of stalls out and it's still working, it's just going really slow, and it's hard to know, is it actually working or not? All right, principle 4. Perceptible information. The design communicates necessary information effectively to the user regardless of ambient conditions or the user's sensory abilities. And I think this is really great to think about for mobile, because we're not just sitting at desks anymore. We're moving around. We're looking at websites constantly on our phones, on tablets, on all sorts of different devices. And so we could be listening to something else while we're trying to navigate information. You have to really take into consideration how people might be looking at that content in a variety of places. Anyways, use different modes: pictorial, verbal, tactile, for redundant presentation. Provide adequate contrast between essential information and its surroundings, so that way people can actually notice it. Maximize legibility of essential information. Differentiate elements in ways that can be described. Make it easy to give instructions. Provide compatibility with a variety of techniques or devices used by people with sensory limitations. Principle 5. Tolerance for error. The design minimizes hazards and the adverse consequences of accidental or unintended actions. So, a great example of this would be, do you really want to delete your profile? Asking for people to clarify first before they do something that's permanent. Arrange elements to minimize hazards and errors. Most used elements most accessible. Hazardous elements eliminated, isolated, or shielded. Provide warnings of hazards and errors. Provide fail-safe features. Discourage unconscious action in tasks that require vigilance. So again, having kind of check in, like, are you sure you want to do this? Having someone have to click twice perhaps to get through an option. Principle 6, low physical effort. The design can be used efficiently and comfortably and with a minimum of fatigue. Now, this one I think is kind of interesting because I've seen so many different ways that people have tried to change technology because of different things that we are capable of doing, and not really thinking about how when you are working with technology over and over and over again, that you really want to try to maintain the most neutral position and try not to move as much as possible, so that way you don't fatigue your users. And some examples I can think of, maybe like if you've ever played like the Nintendo Wii and how there was the motion controls. The motion controls were the hot thing at the time, and a lot of users found that having those motion controls made it really obnoxious when they were trying to play through a longer game because it made them tired over time. Another example I can think of, now I was on a Mac at this time, so I'm a little unsure. I think it's Windows 8, where the start menu had these really large icons to really accommodate and work with how people were starting to have touch screens on their monitors or their laptops. And a lot of people found it really annoying that these buttons took up so much space. They really preferred that minimal design where things, they were a lot closer together. It didn't feel like there was a ton of filler. And the idea is, if you're going and if you're working on a computer a lot, you don't want to have to move your mouse really far. You want to be able to do these smaller motions. So it's important to be able to balance out the touch needs of someone who's working on a touch screen where it's easier for them to click on a large button, but then taking into account that if someone is on a computer, they're wanting to do these smaller, more precise mouse movements without getting fatigued. Another example that this makes me think of is, I remember reading a article, I don't remember what college it was, I kind of want to say it was maybe MIT, but there were these students that were studying technology where they thought, what an inconvenience it is to have to unlock your phone in order to reply to a text message. How great would it be if you could respond to that message without having to actually go in and unlock your screen? And so what they wanted to propose was that you could take your phone and use I'm not really sure if it would be the acceleration or what sort of movements, but it would track your arm's movements, and you could draw out with your arm to type each of the individual characters, so you could actually respond to a message by typing, but without having to actually type it out with your thumbs or unlock everything. You could just go in and you could use gestures instead. And I think one of the things that they really didn't consider with that was the need for precision. The fact that it is a lot easier to type with your thumbs than to have to move your whole entire arm. What if someone isn't able to move their whole entire arm to be able to complete that? And so thinking about, sometimes the simplest solutions are really the best solutions. Sometimes it's better to not overcomplicate things because, if we really want people to be able to use things a lot, we want to make it as easy as possible. So anyways, allow a user to maintain a neutral body position, use reasonable operating forces, minimize repetitive actions, minimize sustained physical effort. Principle 7, size and space for approach and use. Appropriate size and space is provided for approach, reach, manipulation, and use regardless of user's body size, posture, or mobility. Now, this might seem like it's not as fitted for something on the screen, but there's still things that apply here. Provide a clear line of sight to important elements for any seated or standing user. Like, something to think about here would be, what size text do you have on a desktop? Thinking about the typical distance that someone has a desktop computer from their face. How large does the text need to be? Same thing with someone who is on a device like a phone or a tablet. How far are they probably holding that from their face? What size does the text need to be to take that into consideration? Make reach to all components comfortable for any seated or standing user. In our case, it's going to be more where you're locating information on the screen, so that way people don't have to move their heads around in order to see everything. People want to be able to kind of move as little as possible, so being able to see things by just moving your eyes rather than your whole head. Accommodate variations in hand and grip size. This is a good one to consider, thinking about, especially accuracy when you are creating buttons that people could click on their phones. Provide adequate space for the use of assistive devices or personal assistants. So these are all things that I want you to consider. And again, make sure that you go and watch that video because there's some really great examples there. Now the next part I have is an activity. And these are the directions that I have when you are working in class face-to-face. So you don't have to worry about getting a partner for this at all. But what I want you to do is I want you to find a website that has a horrible design, and I want you to think about what it is that makes that design horrible, and I want you to be able to share it with the class. And here I have, what about it do you hate the most? And I've got my own example of the weather.com website, which unfortunately, but fortunately, has been improved over the years, where it's no longer the worst website, but there's still a lot of issues with it. All right, so what you're looking for the homework is this one that says poor website design examples. So after watching the video in week 2 on structure and formatting in web design, find a website that demonstrates poor web design and user experience and post a link to it here. Write a description of what you think makes it a poor design experience. Once you're done, comment on 2 other posts by your classmates. So you're going to want to try to post as soon as possible, so that way that gives other people time to be able to respond to your post. And it's kind of up to you. The website doesn't have to be the absolute worst. I think the best examples, are ones that are functional, and there's just certain aspects about them that could be improved. If it's too bad of a website, it gets to the point where you can't even picture how somebody would use it at all. So some really great websites I've seen over the years have been company websites. Like, you might work at a place, and because you work there, you know what about the website makes it just difficult to work with. Whereas, maybe it's not that bad of a website, but there's just these specific points that don't work very well. It could be a website that you go to quite often. Maybe it's kind of a website that you like to go get information from, or one that you like to go shopping at or something. And maybe you want to share some information about that one. And then if you want to, you can go to Google and you can type in bad websites. Just before you post yours, go and check the other posts, because I don't want everyone to do the same one. And what I found in doing this is people who go to Google and they type in bad websites, they usually pick the same ones. And it's not a problem to see those. Those end up creating some really great conversation too. But I just want to make sure that we're not looking at the same 4 websites over and over and over again, that there's a little bit of variety there. So I'm going to see if I can show you the weather.com website. Now, there is this website that helps to archive the internet. It really only works for websites that are more popular and more common, but you can go and you can look at it. So I'm going to try to see if I can go to the weather.com website as it existed as far back as I can. So I'm trying to think of when I first started showing this example. Let me see if I can jump back to sometime in 2017. Now, you'll notice, depending on the website and how popular it is, there's going to be a lot of different timestamps of how it looked. And one of the unfortunate things about looking at this is it's going to only show what this front page looks like. It won't be able to go to all the other ones. I would have to go and type in the URL for that. But this is what weather.com looked like back in February 2017. And let me see. I might go a little bit further too, but we can kind of take a look at it, because I think you can probably notice that there's already some pretty significant changes to this design. Let me see. So unfortunately, these take a bit of time to load. I'm gonna stick to the 2017. I think that's still gonna be quite old enough, and it'll give us some options. So some of the things, you'll notice it still looks a little bit different from this screen capture I have. It does look kind of similar though, so I think they might be sort of close to each other. I should have looked at the date that I grabbed this from. Now, one of the issues that I had, I go to weather.com a lot because it's a good website to be able to find out information about the weather, but there's certain things that have really frustrated me over the years. And one of the first things that really used to bother me was how the ads would take up a lot of space, how it wasn't clear when something was an ad or not, because the labels for things were really unclear, and then the layout for everything was very inconsistent. And I think that's going to be something that we could probably see here is now this was probably some sort of ad or some sort of kind of pop-up, but we have weather radar and maps, so we've got kind of this general information. But there's some weird things too. Like here it says it's weather radar and maps. Yeah, here we have, here's what's happening during Earth's last colder than average month. So it's climate and weather information, which doesn't seem like it really fits under radar and maps. What I would really like to see here is just a big old map of North America or wherever your location is, that would just kind of show everything that's kind of coming into your general area. Something a little bit more like this. Next we have newsletter. We've got most popular, but most popular what? Not really sure. Latest winter weather updates. So we've got a little information here, and then we've got allergy tracker, safety and prep, photos. It's not really clear if these are photos that are taken by the weather.com website. A lot of the things that are found on this website, they seem to link to other websites and take you off of the website, which is something that if I was a persona, it would be one of my pain points. One of my frustrations is when I don't know how legitimate something is and I don't know if it's actually part of the website or if it's going to take me somewhere else. So I would be very hesitant to click on any of these. And then I've got top picks. Top picks of what? Again, not really sure. And then this page is really simple. Normally what you would also see, and I think part of it is just the fact that it's not able to really archive all the ads that would be here, but normally there would be a ton of ads. And one of the things that the website used to have was, because it would have all these ads, none of these boxes would line up. It would sort of move kind of in a random order. Let me see if I can find. I'm going to try to see if I can find a good example. All right, this is looking a little closer to what I was looking at back when I first started picking on this website. So one of the things I really wanted to mention with this is just the fact that the layout and the way that everything was lining up seemed really inconsistent. So like in this case with the trending section, it's kind of centered, but then this information here is offset to the left, and it's really not lining up with anything. It might be lining up on the left, but it's not lining up on the right. And this is something that was kind of a common issue. It looks like back in 2018 was just they were trying to make things kind of these consistent box sizes, but the way that things would line up would be very different. And it was something I used to find really annoying, was that some things would kind of come over a certain amount, and then some things would go all the way across the page. A lot of this stuff you couldn't really tell, is it an ad for something? Is it part of the website? Here's another one where it's like, this doesn't line up. I guess it lines up with this here, but it just kind of gives this weird sort of like zigzag feel to everything, where it feels very out of order and it looks really confusing. But there are some really nice things about it. Like it has a nice navigation at the top. I like the footer. The footer I've really liked for a really long time. So we've been able to see a couple different versions. Now, this is the current version. and I think it still has some issues, but it's done more to kind of help with labeling things and then create consistency. So with that last example, you're able to see how things wouldn't line up. This one kind of consistently keeps the main content to the left in this column that's the same size, and then any sort of additional things go to the right. And then if these ads or information they have are a variety of sizes, rather than have them kind of stair-step and not kind of really line up, what they did instead was they put these in these tiles, and then they just added padding around it to make sure that they always filled the same size, and it just made the content kind of change the sizes around it. And then what they did for these is they tried to put these headers. So we've got top stories, and then it tells us a little more, and they made this stand out more where we have more stories that we could go to. Some of it is still a little confusing, like trampoline of death, and then we've got one of the world's most dangerous roads. And we got stay safe, not really sure what that is. Featured deal, which sounds like that would take us to somewhere else. Latest news. This map I would love to see towards the top, so I think that's kind of a missed opportunity. Recommended, again, like recommended what? Are these articles? Are these going to take us somewhere else? Photos, don't know whose photos these are. So I'd like to see that. And then we've got some space for more ad stuff. And then I do like the footer. I like the way that you can search for information. You can type in your address. You have the option to kind of personalize things based off your area if you want Fahrenheit or Celsius. There's account information. We've got a really nice hamburger menu. And then you can break things up. Now there's more things too that I could pick on. For example, any of these categories, I think the design of it could look a little different. Let me see if I can, like this here. I appreciate the idea of why it needs to take up so much space, but this information is left aligned so much where there's so little space to the sides, and then there's just a ton of empty space in between. It just feels really off balance and looks really weird. This I don't mind too much. It does, again, it kind of has a lot of white space. This I think looks pretty fine. This looks pretty fine. It looks like you could maybe have a little more information though. And then we've got strange categories like don't miss, daily forecast. So a lot of things broken up. We've got photo gallery, recommended again. All these sort of strange things, which, you know, my eye just gets trained to block out a lot of these things. So in my mind, I feel like it's overwhelmed with junk. Here we've got a little more information. Now this is kind of the opposite spectrum. This looks really tiny. So this feels kind of hard to read, especially these icons are really small. This isn't too bad, but it can be a little hard to read as sort of a table of information. I kind of wish the information was closer to each other so it wasn't so hard to read going across. So anyways, I could go further, and we don't have to go into as much detail, but that's what I want for you to do for the activity is find your own website. It could be one that you use all the time. It doesn't have to be the worst website. I still like weather.com. I still use it. I think it still does a fine job of providing the information. I just wish it could provide a slightly different user experience. All right, so you can do that activity now, take a little break, or you can finish watching this video and then go back to that at the end. Now, the rest of this, I'm going to go into kind of some more information on designing. So this next part, this is looking at different platforms. So when you are designing, you want to remember that you're not just designing for desktops. We're designing for desktops, tablets, mobile devices, and now we've got web apps. There's all sorts of other devices that you can access the internet on. So, and this is just going to continue to grow more and more over time. So a question that I like to ask, and it's one that I think everyone has always misunderstood. So it's a great question, but it's a little confusing. And even back when my professors were asking me the same question, I didn't understand what they were trying to get at. But the idea is, how do our devices see us? And it's not how do they like take in our visual picture. That technically is an option. But the idea is to think about, based off of the inputs and outputs of how we communicate with our devices, what could the device assume about us? And what I really like about this is this came from a textbook that came out, I don't remember the exact year, is either in the 90s or the early aughts. But computers and devices were quite different then. And so they came up with this illustration. So this is from Physical Computing, and by Tom Igno and Dan O'Sullivan. And so what the proposal is, okay, well, computers know that they, let's start with inputs. So the way that we communicate with computers is we do mouse events and key press events. And so a computer could assume that we have some sort of digit, and we're able to put in input by pressing on things. Now, technically, they really should have put probably 2 digits, because we can do multiple key commands at the same time. Like you can do shift and then hit another key. So it's not just having 1 digit, we have at least 2 digits. And then thinking about output, there's the idea of, okay, we put information on a screen, and so we can assume that people have eyes and that they can see information. And then the ears are thinking about how we've got 2 ears and we can listen to the left audio channel and the right audio channel. So you could technically have 2 different audio channels. And this was sort of the capabilities at the time of what a person might look like to a computer. If a computer could only know about us based off of our inputs and our outputs. So if we were to draw this today, and this is a question I like to ask in class, and unfortunately, I really can't hear your responses. It would be really great to see what sort of other things you might think of. If you do think of something that I don't include, it'd be really great if you could go and you could add to the discussion and you could share your own ideas, because it's been really great just hearing how people have envisioned things that I might not necessarily think of. So if I were to change this picture, at least, what I would add would be, like I said, multiple digits. Especially now that we have devices where we can use gestures. So not only are we doing like mouse pressed events, key pressed events, but we're actually keeping track of how we're touching something and we're changing it. We have heartbeats. We've got fingerprints, because those are things that can be tracked on different devices. We've got 2 eyes, so we can create optical illusions like VR by using our 2 eyes to show one eye, one set of information, another eye, a different set of information to create that optical illusion. We still have our audio left and right channels. We've created kind of more complex audio than that, but sort of the basics with the audio. I'm already getting overwhelmed by different options. So we've got our positioning. Like if you think of I think a Wii remote is a good example, because that's where we really started thinking about how things would tilt or rotate from side to side. So thinking about that, we can track acceleration. We can track GPS. So we can actually track like where a person exists in space now, and they can move around, and we can track that space. A really good example I've had from, or an idea I've had from a student in the past, was our data. We've got data, and that data gives us an idea of who we are as a person. Voice. We've got voice interaction now, where you can speak commands and we can use that as input. All right, I think I'm at my limit for things I can think of at the moment. If you any of you can come up with something else, or if you want to build off of one of the examples I have and kind of put a spin on it in a way that I didn't think of, please feel free to comment in the discussion. I'd really like to hear what you all have to say on it, because it's definitely something that's going to continue to grow and change. And part of why I think this is so important is, as we are designing websites, what we're really designing is human and computer interactions. It's this conversation that's happening between us and technology, and then also back to other people. So we're communicating with people, but we're doing it through this medium. And it's important for us to think about how we actually physically engage with the technology, so that way you can think about, how is it being done successfully? How is it potentially being done unsuccessfully? Why do we do things a certain way? Is there a better way that we could be doing things? And really breaking down that user experience. All right, so this next slide is looking at the visual plane, and this goes back to this idea of looking at things on different devices, but I just think it's really interesting how the visual surface that we look at, it's changing how we engage with things. I don't know. If this was an in-person class, I'd love to have people like raise their hand and ask, like, how many people use wearable technology like smartwatches, or how many people really engage with the internet on different devices, like in your car, or maybe I personally don't browse the internet on my game consoles, but I know it's a thing that you can do if you choose to do so. So it'd be really interesting to hear, what are the ways that people are interacting with content. It could be having like a Alexa or something, where you are speaking to a device and you're having them give you information off of the internet, which that ends up being interesting because it's not even a visual plane. Anyways, all right, so some things to consider for a visual plane. Our visual planes are variable. We no longer know the size or the physical characteristics of the field we design upon and the borders of our work. They are dynamic. We can never be entirely certain what browsers, operating systems, fonts, colors, or other foundational display technologies will be present to support the design. I think a good example for this is we can kind of assume the general monitors or laptops that people might be using, but people might even be using older tech. When I first started teaching at home during the pandemic, the computer desk that I only had space for my laptop and a smaller screen. So I had a larger screen that I could choose to work with, but I elected to use one of those old computer monitors that's more of a 4:3 kind of ratio. It basically looks like a square. And so I just use that all the time because it was a thing that fit the best on my desk, and I had it around. And I found out so many websites look awful in that square ratio because they're optimized for being widescreen. We're so used to looking at things as widescreen that we don't take that into consideration. Something else that you might consider too is, I don't know if any of you are interested in using those filters on your phone that try to cut back on blue light, where when it's a certain time of day, your phone changes so that way it has more of a warm light instead of a blue light to kind of help with your eyes, and it can kind of help with issues where people have like insomnia. It's something that I like to have on my phone just to not fatigue my eyes as much. But there's a lot of websites that look really bad in that more kind of yellow light because they've been designed to have a nice clean white look to them. And so that would be another thing to consider. Someone might have their phone set up so that way that the color could be off. I've seen this a lot too, where my husband likes to play games where he cranks up the brightness on the computer monitor, and it just completely washes out most websites or most content that I look at on the computer. And so if I don't want to actually go and change the settings on the monitor. A lot of websites are very hard to look at for a long time just because that monitor setting isn't quite what I think a default should look like. So, everyone sets their content, their devices to different settings, and there could be different reasons for it. And so you can't guarantee how something might look. Ubiquitous. Designs are unbound from desks and have become truly environmental. I think this is really good to think about. For example, if you are on a bus and you're looking for information and the only way that you can find information is on a video, there have been a lot of times where I like to look at videos, but I like to watch them muted so that way I don't bother people around me. And I really like having the captions on, or I like there to be some sort of text through the video that's describing what's happening in it, so that way I don't bother people around me, or I don't feel overwhelmed by all the other stuff going on. And so it's really handy to have other ways of being able to take in that information. And it could just be being distracted or not being able to easily sit down at a desktop. Like, let's say the process that you're trying to do on mobile is hard, but you don't really have an option to go and sit down at a desk or be able to type something out on a keyboard. So being able to take into consideration that people are mobile, responsive, fluid page grids, responsive images. We'll talk about CSS media queries in a couple of weeks. But again, back to that idea of things are always changing. I don't know about all of you, but I often look at my browser window where it's not full screen. I'll change it to all sorts of different sizes because I like to multitask and have everything going on at the same time. All right, so this is a bit of a little bit of a history lesson, but then also just kind of general information. You may or may not be familiar with this idea, but it's this idea that there are different resolutions and there's different aspect ratios. And the resolution is how many pixels you have, both height and width. And then the aspect ratio would be what is the comparison of the width and height to each other. And so there's a couple of examples here where there's 4:3 ratio. Like if I think back to the old TVs or my old monitor that looked really bad with current websites on it, different 4:3 ratios that we would have had. These are the resolution, so the actual pixels that you would have, height and width of these. I remember a lot of 640 by 480 video back in the day. And then now we've got our trusty 16 by 9. And so these are going to be dimensions that you're more familiar with. 1920 by 1080, 1366 by 768. This is like a really good laptop size. If you are on a laptop, there's a good chance that your resolution is something similar to this. 1280 by 720, 854 by 480. So these are all going to be that same aspect ratio. It's just fewer pixels that you have. So usually that means a smaller screen or a larger screen, but now we're actually getting where we can have more pixels per inch. And so you can actually have a higher resolution on smaller screens too now. And I've got some common sizes. These might be a little outdated and you'll see a ton of variation on this. We'll get into this further. But if you were, let's say that you were wanting to design a mock-up for a website, Photoshop and Illustrator, they have some really good templates. And these would be the sort of sizes that they would list in their templates. So 1366 by 768 is kind of, they list it as a desktop size. I think that's more of a laptop size. I would say that I think 1920 by 1080 is going to be more of a monitor size. And then mobile would be like 375 by 667. That's going to be a more of a smaller size. Versus nowadays you get a lot more pixels per inch than that. Tablet is kind of about 768 by 1024, which that's kind of a good small screen size too, kind of a smaller monitor size. This slide is talking about the visual structure and the general way that you organize information on the page. And there's a couple examples of how to put everything together. So like this one, there's nothing is standing out. It's very unclear because nothing is being communicated across. Versus this design has kind of a clear structure as to the headings by having these stand out a little bit from each other, but everything seems like it's of equal importance. This one here, there's kind of a clearer idea of what is most important based off of the color, but then the organizational structure to it seems a little bit more random and it's a little more confusing. Versus this one has a nice balance of all of those things together where there's a clear structure to it, and then it's going from the most important information at the top and then is slowly getting to be less important. So what I'm going to cover next is going to be a lot of design principles. And if you were taking a graphic design class or an art class, there's different principles and elements of design that you would learn and you'd memorize, and you would have all sorts of projects where you practice those things. That's something that gets talked about less in our classes, but it's something that's still very important. And so I just wanted to mention these because it could be the first time that you're hearing about some of these things. I'm not going to make you memorize them, but I want you to know about them in general. So, visual hierarchy, you can communicate the importance of something using various things to make something stand out or have it not stand out. So some things would be the size of it, and that's something we've already looked at with our headings. The contrast, the way that things are laid out, color, the symmetry of things, how unified things are, how much white space you have, how similar things are to each other, and how you group them. And these are going to be some of the designs that get focused on the most. And you'll notice that there's a lot of overlap here. So contrast, you can actually look at contrast in a couple ways. So it could be the colors. You know, you could have orange and blue. They're across from each other on the color wheel, and so they're going to have a lot of contrast from each other. You could also have something be light or dark, and it's going to have a contrast. The more different they are. You could have contrast by shape, you could have contrast by direction. So those things help something stand out from each other or blend in with each other. Repetition helps give people an expectation of how something might be just by you doing the same thing over and over again. Alignment is a good way of organizing the information, whether it's having something be left aligned or lining all up on one side. It just makes everything seem less random. And then proximity is really good because if you have things that are related to each other, they should be close to each other on the page. If you have something that is not related, you want to add a little bit more white space so that way they're distinctly separate from each other. Something that I think gets often overlooked is white space. And in one of my upper level classes, I have students do a project where they practice splitting up their content based off of visuals, text, and white space, and thinking about having those each balance out. Now, there's not any visuals here. It's just text and the general spacing of it, but you don't have to fill up everything in order for it to feel like it is well balanced and that space is being optimized. Now, this is a really good book. It's only looking at print material, and it's something that I have linked on Canvas. So if you want to take a look at this, they have it at the library if you want to check it out. I got it from my public library, but what I like about it is it helps demonstrate how you can work with general layout alignment and how you can have things lay out over 2-page spreads. You can kind of look at the general symmetry or how things line up. Like here, this has the title, it has a line going all the way across, and it's making sure that everything feels lined up. Like here, this text is lining up with the bottom of this image. And it's the sort of thing where when you are first starting, it can feel really overwhelming to figure out how to get good at designing spaces. And so going and analyzing how people have organized their spaces can be a really great way of learning how to do that yourself. This is the idea of looking at things with the rule of thirds. Now this picture is cropped, so it's not really showing it very well, but the idea here is you divide up a visual space into equal thirds vertically and horizontally, and then you try to put kind of areas of interest in the intersections, and it helps keep somebody's eye moving around, so that way it's more engaging and more interesting. This gets used a lot in visual design. And so like here, there's the biker kind of lines up with this top right intersection. And then we've got this mountain in the bottom left intersection. And then there's this nice diagonal that helps our eye move around to the space. Now, this could be better. There's not really anything to draw us to look up here in the top left, but we at least have this strong movement kind of going across, and it feels balanced. Another idea that a lot of artists have looked into is this idea of the golden ratio. And a lot of times people will go and look at like Renaissance paintings, and they'll look at the golden ratio of how things have been organized. The idea here is things in nature have a tendency to grow in a certain ratio, the golden ratio. And because we see this ratio in nature, it's something that we find very pleasing and natural. And so we are drawn to things that in a similar fashion break down in that way. Now, I think sometimes this gets focused on a little bit too much. Like with this painting that's in the center, I think it would be going probably into this idea a little bit too much to put this golden ratio spiral over top of this figure. There is a really nice kind of swoop toward like looking at the face and then kind of moving around the outside of the figure and kind of down over the shoulder. But I don't know that the artist would have necessarily thought so much in detail about the ratio of the face. And you can even see that that spiral doesn't really line up with everything anyways. But I do think there's a little bit of an idea there, at least in some cases. All right, so in order to try to keep this video from being too long, I'm going to go over the next pieces in less information, just because these end up getting talked about more in their own videos later when we introduce the styles for these. So this next section is looking at color, and that's going to be what we look at in chapter 4, and we're going to look at different ways of looking at color. I wanted to put some links here though for if you feel like you could be better at color, maybe you think that you're really bad at working with color. These are some really great websites for helping you choose different color palettes that are really helpful. I personally really like color.adobe.com. And you can even check for accessibility, like checking to see that there's enough contrast. And you can even check to see what your color palette would look like to someone with varying types of color blindness. So if you want to make sure that your website is accessible to everyone, you could go and you could look at that. So we'll look at those further when we talk about chapter 4, but I just wanted you to know about those in general. And that's part of why the list for this week is so long, because I've got links for all sorts of things. So one thing I do want to mention though about color is the color wheel, or I should say the primary colors, work a little bit different with light and screens than they do with paint. So if you do have some art background and you're used to working with painting, or if you remember back to your days of elementary school where you learned the primary colors are red, yellow, and blue, you have to kind of unlearn those colors, because that would be the case if you were going to print something on a printer, for example. But when you're thinking about the primary colors for light, the primary colors for light are red, blue, and green. And we have all those colors work together, and when they are combined, they create white, versus when you combine the colors when you're printing, they make black. So we have to kind of think about things in a slightly different sense. So we're going to be working with the additive primary colors. Here are some illustrations of different methods that we have for working with color. So, and we'll go over this more with chapter 4, but because we're working with red, green, and blue, a lot of times when you are working in, let's say like Photoshop in this case, you could choose a color based off of how much red. So you would have all the red or none of the red, all the green, none of the green, all the blue, none of the blue, and you would mix those colors together to come up with a color, and you would have these different values for it. So that's going to be one method we can use of working with color. And then another one is HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness, but it's also sometimes called brightness, depending on the software that you're using. And so here you have all of the hues that you can choose from. So that's the color, is the hue. Saturation is how intense the color is. If you remove the saturation, you can turn it into grayscale, or you could have it be very intense. It's not the same thing as being bright. It's the intensity of the color, how pure the color is. And then the lightness would be how much white or black, so how light or dark it is. And here's a color wheel that's kind of showing a little bit of that variation. This is looking at the idea of how you can work with different colors. So here's a bunch of colors where it's just working with red in general. So if you were to add green, you could add some contrast here, or you could also vary things by having light and dark variations to the color. You can think about how you can contrast things with complement. So in this case, you could have these two colors are sort of generally across from each other, but then you could vary that color range a little bit in either direction. So there's like a slightly warmer color, a little bit of variety there. You can think about simultaneous contrast, so kind of contrasting in a variety of different ways. Or just thinking about contrasting with both warm and cool colors. Warm colors are going to be like red, orange, and yellow, and then cool colors are going to be green, blue, and purple. And then the image that I have on the right is looking at how when you choose different colors that you combine and put next to each other, you can actually create different illusions. And I don't know how well this is going to be communicated through the video, but the color in the center of each of these is the same color, but depending on the color that is next to it, it can make those colors in the center appear to be different. I think one of the ones that kind of works the best for this, I feel like, is this one here that has sort of this bluish, it's kind of tealish color, but depending on if it's next to the yellow or if it's next to the blue, I think it makes the color inside look a little bit different. Same thing, I think, with like this red one, or down here with the grays. Next, I have a graphic that helps to give just a breakdown of the things that you need to consider for printing versus digital for your text. And I have that under the top section where it says serif versus sans serif. And I'll try to save some of this for when we talk about typography, but general information of how to know when to choose serif or sans serif. So this is first saying what it is. So if you haven't heard the term before, serif is going to be when you've got these smaller decorative details on a character, and then sans serif, sans meaning without, just without those details. So the idea here is when you are looking at something that is printed, you can get a lot of dots per inch to help fill in the details, and so you can have a lot of detail versus if you are on like a mobile or tablet device, you're going to have fewer pixels per inch is what that would be called, because they're pixels instead of dots, which are printed. And then if you're on a monitor, you're going to have even fewer. And so these end up being a lot larger. and you get a lot less detail. So the idea is if you have a serif font, it's very easy to put in that detail and be able to see it very sharply and clearly when it's printed. Versus if you were to look at it on a monitor, it would look very pixelated and it would look kind of blocky. And the idea is serif is really great when you are looking at something printed because you can very quickly identify the characters from each other and read it because you can see that nice crisp detail. So when you're working with print, you want to use serif fonts as much as possible. But then when you are looking at a screen where it ends up getting more pixelated and blocky, it's a lot easier to read sans serif fonts. So that's the Cliff Notes version. Is basically for print, use serif, for screen, use sans serif. And then this kind of goes into more information on the two sets of characters. Some examples like Times Roman, some examples of like what these fonts look like. So some examples of serif fonts, examples of sans serif fonts. So this illustration is kind of the opposite of what we want, but the information still is relevant. So with your headings, you want to, you can have kind of either one. You could have serif, you could have sans serif. It's up to you on how you want to make things decorative. There's less text, so it's not going to matter as much. When you have a paragraph copy like this, though, you want to have sans serif, and that's where they have these percentages where it says 66% sans serif and then 34% serif. So try to pick more the sans serif, even though here it's kind of illustrating it a little backwards. And then here's a nice conclusion where it shows, if it's print, do serif. If it's web, do sans serif, which I think gets across that message pretty quick and easy. All right, so here's another slide where this is something that we'll go into more detail when we cover text and images in chapter 5. And this is just some general tips, like be concise, use common fonts, carefully choose your fonts, check the font size, check the font weight, check the font color, check the line length, check alignment. Text and hyperlinks should be easy to identify. Check your spelling and grammar. And then I've got a couple of websites which you can look at, which kind of take a look at how typography is used. I like to pick on news websites because they tend to go for more of a traditional look to try to fit with how newspapers would organize things layout-wise and then also typography-wise. And I have found that because they tend to stick to that more traditional look, they tend to be a lot harder to read on screen. So you could check out those links. I try to find a variety of different aesthetics for the newspaper websites, but you could go and you could look at any newspaper website or informational website and kind of see how they look if you want. All right, so I'm not going to make you memorize the anatomy of typography, but I did want to point out a few things. So the biggest thing that makes it a font easier to read is going to be the X height, which is basically the height of the lowercase characters. The taller that these lowercase characters are, so the taller the X height is, the easier it's going to be able to read, even if it's a serif font. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense logically. It's basically saying the larger your letters are, the easier they are to read. So if you have a font that has a shorter X height, it's basically making these lowercase letters a lot smaller. So it's giving them less room for them to be able to be seen. And then if you're curious, there's these other terms like descender, ascender, shoulder, serif, bar, all of that. You're not going to have to worry about that. So from a print side of things, these are different terms that are used. And when people are printing, they go in and they manually adjust these things. For us working with web, it's really impossible for us to go in and do a whole lot of this manual adjustment. So kerning is going in and changing the amount of space that's between individual letters. what we would do instead is we would look for a font that already has taken that into consideration. And so you don't have to go in and manually adjust these. So you would want to look for fonts that are going to already have good spacing where it wouldn't need kerning. And then tracking goes in and it adjusts the amount of space between the words themselves. So that could be something that you might take into consideration. And then leading, that comes from the term of when people would use presses, and they would put extra pieces of lead between the lines to adjust the spacing. You'll also hear that called line height. And so you might adjust the line height. And line height is something that helps a lot with making things easier to read on screens. And so I would usually recommend having at least 1.5 times the standard line height. We'll get into that, so you don't have to worry about remembering that. Typography in general is the art and technique of arranging type to make written language legible, readable, and appealing. Some terms that we're going to cover are font family, which is the design of all the characters that are comprised of a family and all its encompassing faces. So font face is something we're going to look at. And then typeface is the specific weight or instance of a particular family. So this is going to help when we do cover text because all of these are going to be grouped together. So you've got the type of font, and then it's just a matter of how much it varies between how bold it is or how light it is. And I would say this ultra light font has been a really popular I kind of want to call it a fad, but we'll just have to see how long. It's a popular style, and it can make it really hard to read on screen, especially from far away. And you can still choose these finer lines, but then you want to think about other ways to help increase the legibility. So it could be making the color have a lot of contrast. It could be having the size of the text larger so it's easier to see from a distance. But you want to be really careful when you're using fonts that are lighter like that. Alignment. So we're going to talk about alignment more in the future, but the basics of it is you have left aligned where you have the text lining up on the left. You've got right aligned, you've got centered, and then justified is stretching the text from the left to the right, and it's adding this spacing between all of these words. And so I would say never use justified when you're working with a website, because while someone who's printing can go in and manually adjust things so it looks a little neater, we can't do that with our websites because they are responsive and it can just look very awkward. And that's called rivers, where you've got these huge gaps. This is just giving a bit of a caution about the line length. Depending on how you are positioned and you're looking at the text, it could be really difficult to read text that's too narrow, where you're having to continually go on to the next line. It could be really inconvenient to read text that's spanning the whole width across the screen. And so you want to think about how wide your column should be. And I like to use this picture because this is from a video, Linus Tech Tips, where he wanted to build this huge display screen for the ultimate gaming experience. But some of the things he didn't consider would be how close he would be sitting to the screen. And so how difficult it would be for him to actually move his head to be able to see everything. And then other thing I thought was funny was this is his map, because the game still thinks that this is the appropriate size for his map. So now he can't see the map from where his head is positioned. So you want to think about all those things. Back to the idea of how different ways that you can create emphasis. You could think about creating emphasis with italics, bolding, underlining, how you use your color, capitalizing, having everything uppercase, lowercase, your spacing, and your indentation. We'll get back to the font face element when we work with fonts. This is a really good website for looking at font combinations. Again, if you're kind of nervous about working and choosing fonts, you can go back and look at that on your own. Here's some links for thinking about how to pick different color schemes. Things to consider would be, don't pick too many colors. 3 to 5 is a good starter amount. Think about the shade, the tint, the tone, and hue. We'll get into all of that more. Next is looking at graphics and how to optimize your images. We're going to cover that in chapter 5, but basically you just want to know that image optimization is a thing, that you would want to make sure that your website doesn't load with really huge images that are going to take forever to load. And you also want to provide alternative text descriptions, so that way if somebody can't see the image, there's a text description for it instead. All right, so thank you so much for bearing with me for this video. I know that it was really long. To kind of wrap things up, I just want to go over what is on here, so then you can kind of know. So I've got the PowerPoint. There's this design principles JPEG. That's an image that was in the PowerPoint. I've got this web design for right to left languages, the basics. This isn't something I talked about. I think I mentioned before that a lot of times I get students that will just ask me questions, which I think are really great, but it's not necessarily part of the lecture content. So the idea here is, I got the question of, well, a lot of the designs talk about looking at content from left to right, top down, but how would you design a website if you were designing for a website that reads from right to left instead? And so if you're curious about that, you can go here and you can read more information. Depending on the language, it could just be a matter of having everything flipped. So for us, we would have the logo in the top left. And if we had a secondary navigation, it would go on the left. And then if it was in a language where they read the opposite direction, you would essentially flip that. And so this is a really good website. And it depends a lot on what the language is and how they would do that. Here's a infographic for the serif versus sans serif. This is a link for CSS WebSafe font combinations. And it's really basic, but it's kind of a good starting place. The top types of modern navigation, responsive web design. This is just looking at some information on the W3 schools. This is a good website for looking at grids, in addition to that book I mentioned, where it gives some examples and it shows how you could actually organize your website based off of grids. We'll talk about that again in the future. These are some books that I think are just good for learning. So one thing when you are working with designing is just kind of building up your visual vocabulary. And I think one of the best ways you can do that is just looking at how other people organize their sites. And so the Designer's Web Handbook goes in and it talks about different pieces of websites, and it gives examples of how other people have designed their websites with the focus on those pieces. And so there's a whole series by Patrick McNeil. So there's the handbook in general. There's it's kind of taking forever to load, but there's these idea books, and then there's one that I like, which is this mobile one that shows examples of a desktop version and a mobile version. And you can check these out from the public library. I wouldn't say that you need to buy them at all. Or if you ever have a chance to stop by my office, if you want to flip through them, I've got these books too. But they're just kind of good to have. Universal design. So I've got the link to the video that I want you to watch, the 7 principles. Here are the websites for helping to look at color palettes. We'll go back and look at these when we look at chapter 4. But I just wanted you to have a place where those were mentioned. Web publishing, these are going to be things that are going to be talked about in the next videos, and then accessibility will also be something. So as far as all of the design things go, everything from choosing color palettes and up are going to be things that we talked about. And you can kind of see there's nothing that you, aside from the video, there's nothing that you're going to have to go back and watch in more detail. All right, so that's going to be all for this video. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or write a comment in the discussion. I'll try to get back to you as soon as possible.